Okay. Well, if thanks for everybody coming back, and we are seeing some repeaters, so welcome back, everybody. This is the third episode of College Comics Go to College with Stephen Bissette, and this is the first part of the dinosaur pop primer. So the next part will be next week. Then we have another session. I can't remember what December 8th is. Somebody's going to have to help me out. But we have a December 8th, which we're going to be giving away some signed prizes by Stephen Bissette at that thing. We haven't quite figured it out, but we will. So if you come to that one, or you got some other friends that are interested and want to win something cool, or want to give somebody a nice Christmas present, or any of that cool stuff, come on to it. These are being recorded, just as Stephen said, and we are posting those within a couple of days. I know that it takes a little bit longer than that sometimes, but on to our website, and you can reach it by linking, and we keep it in a shared Google Drive. What else? Well, I'm just one of the non-professorial people here. I'm just the coordinator of the program, so it's been several times of me and three Steves in a room. So I'll throw it over to my other professor. We'll go with, I think Steve Tucky talked first last time. So SAS, go for it.
Hi, my name's Stephen Albee Scott. I am, like John said, a professor at Jackson College, and basically I'm a nerd and a geek. I'm sure, just like you guys, and so I'm just glad to be here. So I'm gonna shut up and turn it over to Steve Tucky.
Hi, I'm Steve Tucky. I am the other nerd and maybe a geek. And we're thrilled to have you here. The Concatenation Convention, this is one of many talks in this series. We have 9 talks in this series, but this is also one of many events that we're going to be hosting, or we have been hosting. And Concatenation Convention is about bringing together all sorts of different areas or different aspects of our lives that don't normally seem to, sit in the same space, but have a lot in common. And as we're going to find out today, the area of paleontological research and pop culture and comic books and movies and all that stuff, it turns out that not only do they all kind of share a same space, but they also inform each other. And that's one of the cool things about these presentations. And we're really thrilled to have you here. And we're extra crispy thrilled to have Steve Bissette. Extra crispy thrilled to have Steve Bissette sharing with us tonight about the Paleo Pop Primer Part 1. It's a lot of P's. Thanks a lot.
That is a lot of P. All right, go ahead, Stephen.
I guess I'll warn people that you might want to go pee now before we start, but that's up to you. Hi, good evening, everybody, and thanks for joining us tonight. If you're watching this on one of the recordings, thanks for joining us, whatever time of day it is or night that you're listening or watching. My name is Stephen Bissette. I'm speaking to you all from the Mountains of Madness in Vermont. Tonight's talk concerns kind of a crash course in paleontological pop culture. This is the first of a 2-part presentation. Both of them are standalone. There are a lot of aspects of paleo pop culture that I'll just be touching on tonight. And there's a lot of things I've left out of tonight's presentation because I'll be getting into it next week, including some of my all-time favorite stuff, Willis O'Brien, Ray Harryhausen, and so on. I'll be getting into a lot of those aspects of paleo pop culture next week. I want to ask right from the get-go that, as Stephen and John and Stephen mentioned, if you've got questions or comments, please type them into the chat. If it's something timely, Stephen or John will chime in and I'll respond. Otherwise, we'll save all the questions for the end. And I do ask that you keep your questions focused on tonight's topic. We're going to be covering a lot of ground between now and the end of February. There's quite a number of talks ahead, and hopefully we will have some presentation that touches on whatever your particular interest might be. Without further ado, I'll also mention the backdrop behind me. These are actual one-sheet posters that I always put up behind me during the talk. These are out of my personal collection. I have to be careful not to include images from, major studio productions. So I tend to favor, strange indie films. Tonight's tapestry behind me is from 1950, Prehistoric Woman. The one right behind me, I'll move over. This is Journey to the Beginning of Time, which played here in America in the mid-60s, but was made in the 50s. And one of my favorites from Texas, Larry Buchanan's Mistress of the Apes. Say no more. Okay, without further ado, let's get into the talk. It'll take me just a moment here to open that window, and we go. Welcome, folks. Whoops. I guess I'm having some problem here. Hold on, we'll try again. Share screen. Share. And I'm sorry about this. Let's get this up. Wait from start. There we go.
In the beginning, there was PowerPoint.
Okay, Stephen, is this slide up? Paleo Pop Primer? I guess not. Sorry, folks. Let's try it again.
Building expectations.
Yeah,
what you're
sorry
doing.
about
It's
that.
a-
There we go.
That's a
Share.
good trick. I
Are
like
we
it.
there? I think we're there
Well,
now.
we're there.
Okay, great.
Ahoy.
Okay, welcome, Paleo Pop Primer. This is a subject that is near and dear to my heart. The first drawing I ever remember an adult responding to, I must have been about age, I don't know, 3, 4. And I drew what to me on a piece of paper was supposed to be a dinosaur. And my dad looked over my shoulder and said, "Hey, Stevie drew a dinosaur." And the fact that an adult recognized the scribbles that I had made on paper as being anything was kind of the point in my life where the light bulb went off and I went, "Hey, I want to do more of this." And that's what got me drawing. So I literally owe much of my life to my love of dinosaurs, and dinosaurs have definitely loved me back in their crazy dinosaurian way. So I'm going to be covering sort of an overview this evening of paleo pop culture. And I'm going to start with the artist whose work definitely shaped generations of paleontologists and paleontological art, beginning in the early 1900s. And that would be the amazing Charles R. Knight, who was the premier American paleontological artist. Did a lot of work for many different museums in North America. This is a photo of Charles working on one of his sculptures. He trained as a biological artist, very expert in drawing all forms of animal life, illustrated many books, wrote and drew a number of books, including a book on prehistoric man and more than one book on prehistoric animals. And Charles Knight is probably the artist that my generation grew up with, seeing his artwork more than the artwork of any other individual artist. By the time I was born in 1955, Charles R. Knight's illustrations were appearing in almost every major encyclopedia, you know, Encyclopedia Britannica, World Book, what have you. And almost any pop science text that touched at all on aspects of geology or paleontology would feature at least 1 to 5, you know, Charles Knight illustrations in the book. Also, I want to point out, and this is something I'll get into in a bit more detail next week, because I'll also, with the very kind permission of my friend, Dr. Michael Ryan, one of the premier paleontologists who became a very close friend and helped me a great deal when I was working on my dinosaur comic Tyrant back in the 1990s. Dr. Michael Ryan is allowing me to incorporate into next week's presentation some of the scientific information that he has presented to his students at Carleton University up in Ottawa, Canada. One point that Michael makes is that there were aspects of what Charles R. Knight did in his artwork in the late 1890s, early 1900s that actually anticipated a revolution in paleontology and our understanding of the physiology of dinosaurs and prehistoric animals when he did this particular painting of the Carnosaur Laelops. This painting was done in 1897. You can see the year under Charles Knight's signature in the bottom right-hand corner. And here he was depicting the dinosaurs as very lively, ambitious, energetic creatures. And this was quite contrary to the view of dinosaurs that both scientific circles and popular readers would have had at the time, because most scientists and laypersons understood that dinosaurs were most likely cold-blooded creatures and quite sedentary in their ways. And yet here's Charles Knight doing a reconstruction of these dinosaurs either attacking one another or playing. This could be kittenish behavior that we're seeing. And this really anticipates where future generations of paleontologists would be taking paleontological art, especially after the work that paleontologists like John Ostrom pioneered in the 50s and 60s, and the work of paleontologist Robert Backer. And Robert's work began to be presented to the public at large in the 1970s in books like Warm-Blooded Dinosaurs. Most of the work that I grew up with, being a child of 1955, growing up in the late 50s, early 60s, was also a result of a coordinated, very carefully orchestrated public rebranding campaign that an oil company launched in the late 20s, early 30s, and continued throughout the 20th century. The founder of Sinclair Oil was one of the various personalities that were caught up in a political scandal during President Calvin Coolidge's administration, best known as the Teapot Dome scandal. And without getting into the particulars, basically it involved a group of politicians trying to open up protected national parks for oil and petroleum industry use. Does this sound familiar to any of you? It's still an ongoing issue. However, it was perceived as a huge political scandal at the time, and the founder of Sinclair Oil was among the individuals targeted in the investigations that followed. And Sinclair suddenly had to rebrand his oil company in a way that removed his face from any association with this company. And the way they did it is they made dinosaurs the corporate symbol of Sinclair Oil. And this was an ad campaign that began in the 20s. Actually, I found earlier examples of, tire companies and automobile and gasoline companies using paleontological imagery as part of their ads going back to the early 1900s. But it was really Sinclair Oil that latched onto it as the be-all and end-all of their public persona that they were going to put out there. This led to not only the kind of advertising that would appear in magazines and newspapers all around North America, but it also led to them sponsoring some of the first major dinosaur exhibitions, not just in museums, but traveling exhibitions as well, including the very famous Sinclair Dinosaur exhibit at the Century of Progress exposition in the early 1930s. For this exposition, life-size, semi-animated models of certain prehistoric animals, including lots of dinosaurs, made this one of the most popular exhibits at the Century of Progress World's Fair exposition. This Sinclair exhibit did not end with the end of the Century of Progress exhibition. They then toured this exhibit and the individual models later on around North America. And this became a real fulcrum for the popularization of how dinosaurs and prehistoric life forms were portrayed in the pop culture. This kind of association between Sinclair Oil as a sponsor for this sort of pop science, and the very successful rebranding of Sinclair Oil, including making Dino the dinosaur, then known as the Brontosaurus, later re-identified as the Patasaurus, their corporate trademark, their symbol. This is a photo from the early 1960s World's Fair Sinclair exhibit. These were, again, life-size models that were constructed in northern New York State and flatbedded, floated down the Hudson River to where they were going to be finally set up and exhibited as part of the World's Fair in 1963-64. And again, these models, after the completion of the World's Fair, then were relocated to new homes in different parts of North America. For instance, one of the Tyrannosaurus Rex full-size models from the Sinclair exhibit ended up at the Boston Science Museum. Whoops, sorry. All right, there were a few other artists I want to bring to your attention as well. Charles R. Knight, again, is like the premier launch point for all of the 20th century paleontological pop culture iconography and imagery that we'll be looking at tonight. But there were others. In Czechoslovakia, the premier Eastern European paleontological artist of the 1940s, 50s, 60s was an incredible illustrator and artist named Zdeněk Burian. Burian had cut his teeth doing book illustrations, painterly wash illustrations, beautiful lavish pen and ink illustrations. He illustrated the works of Jules Verne, the works of Edgar Rice Burroughs, very popular artist in Czechoslovakia, but it was his paleontological life form reconstructions that spilled beyond the borders of Czechoslovakia and made him probably one of the most world-renowned paleontological artists of the late 20th century. Another artist, a contemporary of Burian's, whose work made an equally powerful impact, was an American artist named Rudolf Zallinger. Zallinger is best known for the murals that he painted for the Chicago Field Museum. He also did this amazing fold out dioramic view of prehistoric life that was published in Life magazine in 1955. And that is looked back at as sort of the springboard for an entire generation of dinosaur kids, which is, you know, the generation I'm part of. The Rudolf F. Zallinger book that any kid could buy and take home is the one pictured here, Dinosaurs and Other Prehistoric Reptiles. It was a hardcover giant golden book. Golden book was published by Western Print and Litho out of Wisconsin, and their Dinosaurs hardcover book was incredibly successful and popular, went into multiple printings. And the original artwork that Zallinger did for this book is just spectacular. This is one of my favorite spreads from the book that I've got up here on the screen. So those are the three key artists for the early to mid 20th century: Knight, Burian, and Zallinger. By the way, there is now a new edition of the Big Golden Book of Dinosaurs. Pictured in the inset here, I've got the cover of the Zallinger illustrated edition. And there's a new edition that's illustrated by Louis V. Rey, R-E-Y. It's very beautiful, but you'll forgive me saying I held on to my copies of the original from the 1950s. If you're a serious lover of dinosaurs, you need both these books. I'll leave it at that. There was another odd artifact of late 1950s pop culture that I want to bring to your attention before we get into the different pop culture media. And that was that Marx Toys released in 1958 a 44-piece prehistoric animal set, The World of Prehistoric Beasts and Cavemen. This is a scan from one of the Sears catalogs, Christmas catalogs from 1958, which were almost as important as a household having a copy of the Bible back in the 50s or 60s, was the Christmas catalogs every year that Sears put out. And I was one of millions of kids who was gifted this playset that particular Christmas. And these little plastic dinosaurs are as copied by cartoonists in comic books and comic strips that followed as the work of Knight or Zallinger or Burian. In fact, you might be able to argue, based on many of the Silver Age comic books out there, that more cartoonists use these Marx figure toys as their models for when they have to draw a dinosaur in a comic story than any of the artists I have shown you thus far. Okay, I also want to bring to your attention that there's one comic book when I was 4 years old that was the wellspring for my copying the dinosaurs that appeared inside this comic book. This was the comic book that really kicked off my career, if you will. There was a series called The World Around Us. These were oversized, giant annual sized, I would say, comic books published by Gilbertin, the creators and publishers of the Classics Illustrated line of comic books. And the World Around Us series was a series that came out every month. They were 25-cent, almost 100-page comics, slightly square bound. And each issue would involve some aspect of history or science or biology or travel, some discipline. And this issue, which hit in 1959, my mom bought it for me off our local newsstand in Essex Junction, Vermont, a little store that was called Towns Market right by the railroad tracks. I brought this comic home and I wore out my copy in less than 4 weeks. And the reason I know I wore it out in less than 4 weeks is, remember, this was a monthly comic series. My mom went out and did something she never had done before and that she never did again. And she bought me a second copy of the illustrated story of prehistoric animals, because I had literally worn the first one to flinders by tracing and copying the artwork inside. Two of the artists inside became very important to me. First and foremost, Sam Glanzman, whose work I'll be touching on tonight, and an artist who later became a friend of mine, the great Al Williamson. Both Sam and Al were people I got to talk with on the phone. And in the case of Al Williamson, I actually got to know him a bit, got to visit his home when my friend Rick Beach was working with Al Williamson in Al's studio. And their work in this comic just was life-changing for me. Oh, doesn't want to go there. There we go. All right, part 2 of tonight's talk. Let's talk about fantastic paleo pop, specifically paleontological reconstructions, literary fictions that incorporate man, including early man, biblical early man, and or contemporary man, into prehistoric environments. I do not know, nor do I wish to know, the religious or personal beliefs of anyone who's joined us here tonight, and I certainly don't mean to insult anybody, but I will say that according to contemporary science, there was no time in the past in which human beings cohabitated on this planet with dinosaurs. However, the most popular vein of fantastic paleo pop involves just that. So let's get into it a bit, shall we? I kid you not, thousands, not just hundreds, thousands of magazines, newsstand magazines, mail subscription magazines, fanzines, et cetera, that present different permutations of people and prehistoric animals cohabitating, specifically people and dinosaurs cohabitating. Because even though we know prehistoric human beings did inhabit the earth at the time of some of the prehistoric elephantines and prehistoric horses, prehistoric rhinoceroses, prehistoric bears, all those creatures, cool as they are, giant sloths, bears, giant rhinoceros, and so on, are not as cool as dinosaurs. That's just how it is. And the pop culture loves to present this kind of material. The wellspring for this vein of literary fiction is this book, which was published in Paris in 1861. It was a book written by Pierre Bétard, and it was the first dramatization in written form of the life of a prehistoric family, prehistoric man and his mate and their offspring. So here is the wellspring of almost all the prehistoric fiction that followed. However, the one that is most popular and still in print to this day is an original work of science fiction by the great Jules Verne, a book popularly known here in North America and in all English-speaking countries as Journey to the Center of the Earth. It was originally serialized and published in 1864. And what's unusual about this Jules Verne book is that Verne rewrote it a couple of times. He added material to editions subsequent to the first printings. Then, when his work was translated into other language, translators would add material to the book. It's very hard today to find an English language translation that's true and accurate to what Verne originally wrote. The reason Verne did the rewriting is more and more of the hard science that was coming out in the 1860s that so fascinated him involving prehistoric life forms excited his imagination to the point where he decided, oh, I've got to add that to the book. The most famous aspect of Journey to the Center of the Earth, if you've ever read the novel, is undoubtedly the battle in the inner sea, the ocean in the hollow earth, in which two prehistoric sea reptiles have a battle to the death. What Verne was working from were reconstructions from the fossil record of prehistoric oceanic reptiles like plesiosaurs. This is the most, what's the word I'm looking for? The most long lasting. I mean, this image has the greatest longevity of association with Jules Verne's novel, including covers of, various editions of the book. When Classics Illustrated did their comic book adaptation of Journey to the Center of the Earth, that was what the cover spot was that battle between the giant sea reptiles. In 1959, 20th Century Fox released a pretty tremendous fantasy film starring James Mason, Arlene Dahl, Diane Baker, and then hot rock and roller Pat Boone. I don't know if Pat Boone was ever really a rock and roller, but top 40 artist, recording artist. Journey to the Center of the Earth in CinemaScope, color by deluxe. And if you've never seen it, I do recommend you check out the film. It's long, it's over 2 hours. It runs like a Marvel comic universe movie does today. But it's a lot of fun, and it was a huge, huge hit in 1959 and was constantly reissued in the early 60s, especially at drive-ins, until it became a staple on television beginning in the mid-60s. It did not recreate the battle between the giant sea reptiles in the novel. The limitations of special effects at that time and the fact that 20th Century Fox was not going to spring for the kind of stop motion animation I'll be talking about next week meant that the big sequence with the dinosaurs took place on the beach of the hollow earth ocean that the explorers come upon. And the prehistoric animals that they come upon are fin-backed dimetrodons, played in the film by rubber fin customized iguanas. Still, pretty terrific use of lizards as dinosaurs, probably the best in cinema history. There were also records that came out. I mean, story LPs used to be quite popular in the 40s, 50s, and early 60s, and there was an entire line of Wonderland records, recorded adaptations of famous novels, and they did do an adaptation of Journey to the Center of the Earth. And here is the cover art by the great Wally Wood, one of the EC Comics peers and very close friend of Al Williamson. There's other books that came out. I'm only going to touch on a couple of them. None of these are as well known or were ever as popular as Jules Verne's Journey to the Center of the Earth. But all of the ones I'm going to touch on this evening were important to the evolution of paleo pop fiction in the late 19th century, early 20th century. The key one, to my mind, that followed Jules Verne's Journey to the Center of the Earth is a book called A Strange Manuscript Found in a Copper Cylinder. And it was written by a popular adventure writer named James DeMille. He was a Canadian. He wrote it in the 1860s, but he either wasn't entirely happy with it or couldn't find a home for it. And he died with this work being unpublished. And after James DeMille passed away, his widow decided to resurrect the manuscript and submitted it to Harper's Weekly, one of the most popular magazines of the era. And Harper's Weekly serialized A Strange Manuscript Found in a Copper Cylinder and published it in 1888. And immediately on the heels of the completion of the Harper's Weekly serialization, it was put out in book form. Yeah, it's a pretty amazing novel. I mean, like a lot of 19th century adventure fiction, it can be a pretty dry read for 21st century readers. But it's out there in multiple editions because it's public domain. What doesn't appear in the current editions is no one ever reprinted all the Harper's Weekly illustrations, which were really quite lovely. The reason this particular novel is of interest to me is I believe that DeMille was the first author to anthropomorphize a prehistoric reptile as a character. There's no characterization of the aquatic prehistoric reptiles that attack our hero during his journey into a lost land inside the Arctic ice lock, where he finds a hidden civilization. But in that hidden civilization, they use pterosaurs as their main means of transportation. They ride them like, horses or dragons, if you're into dragon fantasy. And one of those pterosaurs becomes a very important character. The pterosaur that the heroine of the novel and the hero of the novel used to escape captivity in the Lost Kingdom that the hero stumbled upon, valiantly battles to the point of its last breath to get them to safety. And this makes A Strange Manuscript a very key work in paleo pop fiction, to my mind. There's also a lot of strange short fiction. I'm only going to touch on a couple of the pretty astonishing short stories involving imaginary prehistoric animals. One of the earliest short pieces of fiction that is usually cited by science fiction historians as being the first prehistoric short science fiction story, although it's not, is The Lizard, which was written by C.J. Cutcliffe Hine. It was originally published in the Strand magazine in February of 1898. This is the illustration that accompanied that original publication. And it's probably the first story involving a prehistoric life form thawed from ice. The hero of this story conjectures that this bizarre prehistoric reptile that inhabits this cave thawed out of prehistoric ice in the depths of the cave. However, the prehistoric animal he finds is unlike anything then known or ever found in the fossil record. And as you can see from the illustration, it has this weird pair of tentacles that sprout off of its snout. It's blind. It's an albino. It's a pretty imaginative monster. And it does stretch the definition of a prehistoric animal appearing in a work of science fiction. But yeah, it has to be included in any overview of the literary form. My personal favorite, though, and I know this is a favorite of my friend Dr. Michael Ryan's, is a story entitled The Monster of Lake Lemaitre by Warden Allen Curtis. This was published in Pearson's magazine, August of 1899. So here we are right at the cusp of the conclusion of the 19th century. This is a post-Civil War story in which a military division discovers a lake in northwestern America where there is a prehistoric plesiosaur living in the lake. What makes this story unusual is it's not enough to have a living prehistoric plesiosaur in this lake. The hero's best friend is mortally wounded, and before he dies, his brain is transplanted into the skull of this plesiosaur. So this is the first work of paleontological pop culture involving brain transplants of a human brain into a prehistoric monster skull. I understand this probably sounds like a fairly narrow subgenre to be talking about, but if you're not aware of the late Paul Walker's, one of his first films that he made before he became a huge star, thanks to the Fast and Furious franchise, was a film called Tammy and the T-Rex, in which he plays a high schooler who is killed in an accident and his brain is transplanted into a living Tyrannosaurus Rex. So it is a vital subgenre. Okay, I'm being a little flippant there, but that is a great story. And if you've never read it, go find it online. The Monster of Lake Lemaitre. The next novel that I would consider a key novel in this chronology from 1901 is a novel called Beyond the Great South Wall, written by an adventure novelist named Frank Seville. And this is kind of the beginning of the whole King Kong archetype, if you will. The premise of Beyond the Great South Wall is that somewhere down in South America, in the ruins of a past civilization, there lurks a being called the Great God K. And when our hero and the expedition he's part of finally finds this lost city, they indeed find a living species of the Great God K, and the author cites it as belonging to a completely fictional species that he calls Brontosaurus excelsus. As you can see from the original illustration here by Robert Mason from 1901, the first book publication of this novel, that dinosaur doesn't look remotely like a Brontosaurus. And as we get into a lot of the comic book paleo pop culture, you'll have to get used to the fact that a lot of illustrators either didn't bother or didn't have in reach any kind of proper paleontological illustrative reference, and they worked with what they'd heard of or knew. The Great God K in the illustrations in the book looks more like a Ceratosaurus than any Apatosaurus that ever lived. Let's make a little leap into film, okay? I'm going to save most of the discussion of dinosaur and prehistoric man cinema for next week, but I am going to touch on a few key ones. These are very murky images, and I apologize for that. I will describe to you what you are seeing here. These are grabs from D.W. Griffith's biograph two-reel short, Man's Genesis, which was released in 1912. And these represent the first use of living animals customized with fabricated, limbs and horns and so on to stand in as dinosaurs. For instance, in that first image, which you can probably barely make out, that is a caveman on the left of the image leaning against a rock, and slithering toward him from the bottom right of the frame is a boa constrictor, onto which D.W. Griffith, the great director of Intolerance, Way Down East, a number of other silent films, including the very notorious and controversial Birth of a Nation, he had his prop man affix some kind of a collar with a horn on it onto the boa constrictor. And that is supposed to make the boa constrictor look like a prehistoric reptile. It doesn't. It looks like a boa constrictor with a very uncomfortable collar around its neck. The other two images, which are probably almost impossible for you to discern, the top right one is a full-on shot of an alligator crawling toward you. And affixed to the poor alligator's back is not 2, but 4 wings and a nasal horn. The bottom image is the best frame grab I could find or create of this alligator, which you can more clearly see now up on its front legs. It's opening its mouth, and you can see there's a pair of wings right above its front shoulder, and there's a pair of wings barely visible that are on the back of its back legs before the tail. And that white thing coming up off the front nasal area of the poor put upon customized alligator is supposed to be a nasal horn on the dinosaur. Quote, dinosaur, unquote, dinosaur. These are the first uses that I know of, that I have found anywhere, of using living reptiles to try to fabricate on-screen prehistoric reptiles. Man's Genesis was so popular in 1912 that D.W. Griffith wrote and directed a two-reel sequel called Brute Force, which was released in 1913. If you're curious about seeing it online, it's available on YouTube, not under the title Man's Genesis or the title Brute Force, but there's a compilation of the two kind of stuck together called Primitive Man. And if you go Googling for D.W. Griffith Primitive Man, it'll bring you to it and you can watch it. The cool thing about Brute Force is there is actually a sequence where a life-size Ceratosaurus was fabricated for the film, a full-sized model propped up behind a cave where the cave tribe that are the heroes of Brute Force live. And I've got two frame grabs here where you can see the model. It was sort of built with the back legs being kind of the axis of the model, so they could tip up the tail to bring the head down, or they could tip the tail down toward the ground to bring the head up. When it's first seen in the film, it looks like it's eating a hunk of hay, but I think it's supposed to be eating a caveman. The cave women in this film wear these grass skirts, so I think when it was presented in the film, it was supposed to be a shocker that this full-size dinosaur was devouring one of the members of the tribe. Anyway, this is the ground zero in American filmmaking of using full-size, what later would be called animatronic figures to simulate prehistoric life forms on the big screen. The breakthrough novel, the most popular work of early 20th century paleontological fiction, after Jules Verne's Journey in the Center of the Earth, is without a doubt Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's The Lost World, which was first published in 1912. And Conan Doyle was so in love with this book. I mean, he really loved the character of Professor Challenger, who was his scientific hero, who leads the expedition to South America, to this lost plateau where prehistoric life forms still live. Conan Doyle so loved the character of Professor Challenger that he actually had a theatrical makeup artist make him up as Professor Challenger and take photos of him playing his own character. And that is a touched up photograph of Conan Doyle playing Professor Challenger at the bottom center of this illustration from one of the early editions of the book. As you can see, there's a lot of exciting action in the Lost World involving prehistoric life forms, including the sort of troglodyte tribe that lives up on the plateau and so on. This really is the archetypal novel of 20th century paleontological fiction. So much so that Michael Crichton borrowed the title for his sequel to the book that bookends the 20th century, Jurassic Park. Jurassic Park was a huge hit as a novel, became a huge hit as a Steven Spielberg film adaptation. And when Crichton wrote the sequel to it, he wholeheartedly lifted the title The Lost World, knowing that the bulk of his readership would make the association with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's original novel. By the way, Conan Doyle's novel was adapted to the big screen as The Lost World in 1925, and I'll talk about this in some detail next week. Suffice to mention to you all that the stop motion animation created by Willis O'Brien and his team to bring the dinosaurs to life in The Lost World was so innovative in 1925, so unlike anything any audience had ever seen, that the year before the film was released, when it was still under lock and key, in fact, the producers of the film, First National Pictures, who later became Warner Brothers in the early sound era, they were so unsure of the viability of Willis O'Brien's special effects that they actually shot a complete feature that could have been released without the dinosaurs. That's how little faith First National had in it, that they prepared a second version of the film that would just be live action adventure, no dinosaurs whatsoever. The further they got into the production of the film, the more everyone realized involved with the production that O'Brien was indeed pulling off the dinosaur animation with incredible skill and believability. So the film was a huge hit when it came out in 1925. But in 1924, before anyone knew the film was about to come out, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle played a little joke on a group of magicians in New York City. There was a informal meeting on a regular basis of magicians and illusionists, and one of the founders of this group was the great Harry Houdini, the escape artist and the man who spent much of the last 10 years of his life traveling the world debunking spiritualism. Conan Doyle got his hands on, with permission of Willis O'Brien and First National, a test reel of the stop motion animation of the Dinosaurs for the Lost World. And Conan Doyle showed up at this magician's meeting and said, I have something amazing to show all of you tonight. And he claimed to them that a camera had been invented that could photograph the past of Earth through the ether of time. And what they were going to see were the first films ever shot of actual living prehistoric animals. And he showed the test reel, and the magicians were blown away. They bought it. They believed it, apparently. Because the next day in the New York Times, Conan Doyle's letter was published in which he spilled the beans that what he had shown Harry Houdini and the magicians that night was a special effects fabrication of prehistoric life. And he ended the letter by saying, and now, Mr. Houdini, confidence for confidence, tell me how you got out of that trunk. So anyway, to audiences in the 1990s, when we first saw the computer-generated special effects for Jurassic Park, the first film in the Jurassic World body of work as it now exists, audiences were blown away by how realistic, by how believable those Jurassic Park dinosaurs were. That's how audiences responded in 1925 to The Lost World. Okay, backtracking from The Lost World, I'm picking up the timeline from the publication of the novel The Lost World in 1912. The next key piece of paleontological pop culture I want to bring to your attention is the beginning of animated cartoons involving dinosaurs. And that would be, without a doubt, Winsor McCay's classic Gertie the Dinosaur from 1914. Winsor McCay hand drew all of the Gertie and prehistoric mammoth, and there's a prehistoric flying reptile with 4 wings that flies through at one point. All of that was hand drawn, hand animated by Winsor McCay. And he had an assistant whose job it was to trace the backgrounds faithfully in every single drawing. This is before cell animation had been successfully revolutionized. And Gertie the Dinosaur was a tremendous hit. In fact, when it was originally presented, Winsor McCay would appear live on stage with Gertie. And if you go looking online, or you've ever seen the restoration of Gertie the Dinosaur, there are key points toward the end of Gertie the Dinosaur where Winsor McCay would interact with Gertie. And at the end of the cartoon, by walking behind the screen, it would appear to the audience that he had stepped in front of Gertie the Dinosaur, and she would pick him up in her mouth and set him on her back, and he would ride her off screen. Very ambitious vaudeville use of live action himself and line drawn animation in 1914. The other key work that came out in 1914 was Edgar Rice Burroughs' At the Earth's Core. The illustrations and the cover art were by the great Edgar Rice Burroughs illustrator, J. Allen St. John. And At the Earth's Core was an immediate hit, and this introduced the realm of Pellucidar, his own take on Jules Verne's Journey to the Center of the Earth, which again hinged on the premise that inside of Earth there was another entire realm in our hollow Earth, and prehistoric life forms still lived there. In 1915, there was an equally significant work published that is very well known in Russia and Eastern Europe, but not very well known at all in English-speaking countries. And that is a tremendous work of science fiction called Plutonia by Vladimir Obruchev. First published in 1915, and the premise of Plutonia is that a group of explorers have found an area on planet Earth previously unexplored, that the further you go into this realm, the further back into time you're moving. All the life forms that ever lived on Earth still live in this sort of vortex. And as you move deeper and deeper and deeper into this geography, the older and older the life forms get, so that the explorers are actually moving back through time by pursuing this travel, by taking this jaunt. It's a terrific piece of science fiction. It's basically a work of pop science. It was Oberchev's belief that he could use popular fiction to popularize then current theories and the then current science of paleontology, and it worked. This work is so well known in Russia and Eastern Europe that it was eventually adapted for young audiences into live action director and animator Carl Zayman's Journey to the Beginning of Time. Cesta do Pravěka originally was released in Czechoslovakia and Eastern Europe in 1955. It took about 10 years for it to make its way over to America. My generation grew up with Journey to the Beginning of Time being something that either was seen on the early form of public television. The American distributor of the film broke it up into a serialized TV adventure of half-hour segments, and it was a staple of early public television in the 60s. And it was released as a feature film, dubbed into English as Journey to the Beginning of Time, starting in 1966. Played the matinee circuit for years, one of the staples of childhood productions, matinee circuit films. Okay, going back to the chronology. So 1918, Edgar Rice Burroughs writes The Land of Time Forgot. This is, again, illustrated by the great Jalyn St. John, who did the cover art that you're seeing here. And this was Edgar Rice Burroughs not revisiting Pellucidar. He now introduces another whole Lost World realm with the very imaginative twist that there's a humanoid tribe that from the time of childhood to their end of their life, they actually evolve as a species, as individuals. They go through different life stages in which they evolve. It's a pretty imaginative novel, fun read. And like all of Edgar Rice Burroughs' works, I highly recommend you give him a read, but do prepare yourself for the fact there are certain aspects of his work that have not aged particularly well. So this gets us into the prehistoric pulps. These Edgar Rice Burroughs novels were originally serialized in story magazines in the early 1900s. And by the 1920s, a number of the story magazines have sort of morphed into the first science fiction pulps and the first horror pulps, specifically in terms of science fiction. In fact, it predates the name science fiction. The pulp magazine Amazing Stories, and if you look at the bottom right-hand corner of the cover, you'll see at the time it was called Science Fiction. Amazing Stories was the premier pulp science fiction magazine, featured dinosaurs many times, including stories that involved, a Tyrannosaurus Rex saving the Earth from the invasion of insect-like moon invaders, right? So we owe the fact that we here, the human species, still live and survive on planet Earth to the fact that some dinosaurs saved us from extraterrestrial invaders before man even existed. Astounding Stories of Super Science was another one of the science fiction pulps, including a very strange novelette called The Moon Master that involved a trip to the moon, where it's found that the dinosaurs that died off on Earth are all still alive up on the moon. Weird Tales magazine, the premier and first ever horror fiction publication, also had its share of prehistoric life tales. The ones that most people might be familiar with today would be the short fiction of H.P. Lovecraft. I mean, when you think about it, the whole premise of Cthulhu and the old ones, these ancient prehistoric beings that are waiting to reclaim Earth from the human species, you know, they're a variation of prehistoric pop culture in their way. But there were more typical dinosaur stories that appeared in Weird Tales. This cover story, A Million Years After, by Catherine Metcalf Ruth, was published in November of 1930. And this is one of the earliest stories that reached a popular audience that involved a prehistoric egg being found, and it's in perfect condition. And once it's removed from the cold hollow of the earth that it's laid in for millions of years, exposed to the air and warmth of the sun, it hatches, and a prehistoric dinosaur grows from a hatchling to a full-size adult, wreaking much destruction. By the way, this is a story that H.P. Lovecraft singled out as being one of the worst examples of fiction published in Weird Tales, in his humble opinion. Then in 1933, King Kong hit the screen. This was the first new work from Willis O'Brien, the special effects maestro who created the stop motion prehistoric monsters in the 1925 The Lost World. And I won't go on and on about King Kong, even though I could and probably should. This was a tremendous hit in its day, not just in America, but all around the world. Smash hit film. And this kicked off an entire wave of paleontological, pop cultural artifacts and imitators. King Kong, still a tremendous film and still the best version of any of the King Kong variants that followed. Willis O'Brien and worked with model maker Marcel Delgado, who sculpted and created the stop motion models that Willis O'Brien animated frame by frame using stop motion animation. There's a tremendous battle midway through King Kong between the giant ape Kong and a Tyrannosaurus Rex. The science is all wrong. There was no Tyrannosaurus Rex that ever looked or acted remotely like this. It's got the wrong number of fingers. The tail bends and wraps around in ways that we know T-Rex couldn't possibly have moved in the real world, but it doesn't matter. It's still the premier sequence of all paleontological pop culture from the 20th century. This success of King Kong meant that the pulps went crazy. Giant prehistoric monsters were a staple of science fiction and fantasy pulps after that. Whether it was the giant prehistoric creatures that would pop up in Robert E. Howard's Conan the Barbarian short stories, or one-off stories featuring giant prehistoric animals attacking various metropolitan centers like Washington, D.C. on this cover. The prehistoric pulps were incredibly imaginative, incredibly inventive in the ways they found of bringing various prehistoric life forms into the contemporary world. There's a couple of novels I want to bring to your attention that you probably never heard of. A world famous mathematician by the name of Eric Temple Bell loved science fiction. Eric Temple Bell also, despite his being a professional mathematician, highly respected in the academic sciences, also loved to write science fiction. When he wrote science fiction, he used the pen name John Taine. And his one prehistoric novel that I want to bring to your attention was called Before the Dawn, Television and Time. And the entire premise of Before the Dawn is that scientists find a rock, a form of mineral that they've never discovered before. And it is an element that originally comes to their attention as being sort of a translucent variant of quartz. But they realize that as they look into it, if they light it a certain way and look into it properly, they can see back in time. And Before the Dawn presents the entire lifespan of its hero, a Tyrannosaurus Rex. And the novel ends with the death of this dinosaur. It's a pretty amazing piece of paleo pop culture, relatively unknown since its publication in 1934, in part because John Taine / Eric Temple Bell wrote other science fiction novels that are better known. But this is still in print to this day. It's been in public domain for years, so outfits like Dover Books have kept it in print in various editions. All the pulp heroes also had their brushes with dinosaurs, you know? Pulp heroes like Doc Savage. He visited the Land of Terror, where prehistoric monsters still live. The Shadow had a battle with the devil monsters. His excursion into the realm of lost worlds and living prehistoric creatures. There were also plenty of pulp characters who are forgotten today, who had their brushes with prehistoric creatures still living. And there are others who, had a short lifespan in the pulps, but have made the leap into other media, Prominent among them, Khazar the Great, published by Martin Goodman, who was later the publisher of Marvel Comics. Khazar leaped from the pulps that Martin Goodman published into the Marvel Comics universe, particularly for my generation when he popped up in the Fantastic Four. Movies. You know, nobody could really follow up King Kong. In fact, the producers of King Kong made a sequel called Son of Kong in 1933. Came out the same year as King Kong, but it wasn't a brush on the old man. The next major attempt to do living dinosaurs on the big screen was a film called Unknown Island. And I include it in tonight's slideshow because it features the first ever color dinosaurs on the big screen. This was released in 1948. And as you can see, those dinosaurs don't look particularly believable. And there's a reason for that. They are actually 8 to 9 foot suits that not stuntmen, not trained stuntmen, but extras were stitched into these suits. And for an entire day in California, they filmed these poor, overheated wretches inside these dinosaur suits, stumbling around because they couldn't even see where they were going. I recommend, if you want to enjoy a vintage old dinosaur movie, that you check out Unknown Island. If you're a fan of what people love to call, you know, movies so bad they're good, Unknown Island should be key on your list. There is a moment in Unknown Island where one of the extras inside the dinosaurs passed out from heat stroke and falls over in a dead lump. And they kept it in the film. They just overdubbed a gunshot so that it sounds like the dinosaur was shot and falls down. But what you're actually seeing is that poor bastard in the suit keeling over from heat stroke. Nobody died in the production of this film, I'm happy to report to you. Okay, in terms of science fiction, the next big wave pops up in England. These are almost unknown novels here in America, but they were popular in England. A science fiction writer named John Russell Fearn, who wrote science fiction under a multitude of pen names, including Volstead Gridband, definitely one of my favorite pen names out there. He wrote a book called The Thing of the Past in 1953, and it introduced the character of Herbert the dinosaur, an egg that is pulled up from underground. A prim and proper post-World War II British couple bring the egg into their garage. It hatches, and they raise little Herbert from baby dinosaur to adult dinosaur. And it's a good thing they do, because when a procession of living giant dinosaurs start marching up from under the earth and attack the surface of England, it's Herbert who corrals the dinosaurs and leads them back underground. This novel was popular enough in England that in 1954, Fearn wrote a sequel called The Genial Dinosaur. This is the cover of the original British edition of the book, still under his Volstead Gridband name. In this novel, Herbie the dinosaur returns, and having already saved the planet once, saves us again, but this time from invaders from Venus. He saves the Earth from alien invaders. Same writer, John Russell Fearn, also authored in 1954 the British novelization of The Creature from the Black Lagoon, which was the Universal Pictures film from that year, which originally was released in 3D, that introduced the most popular post-King Kong prehistoric character into pop culture, the Gill Man, a living amphibious hybrid of fish, reptile, and human being. This was published under a different pen name, Vargo Staton. And I believe Fearn had something like 5 or 6 pen names that he published under. This was a very hard to find book. I had never read it. I knew it existed. And then it was reprinted in 2011 by Dreamhaven Books in a limited edition hardcover. And if you go looking for it, you might be able to find a copy out there. Okay, the other thing that happened in 1954, which is pretty important, is a super low budget film made for under $200,000, was independently produced. And it was a film that was put together under the title The Monster from under the sea. But the thing that set it apart from any other film since King Kong is the fact that the prehistoric reptile that had come back to life, which was called the Rhedosaurus, a completely imaginary prehistoric reptile, was stop motion animated by the late great Ray Harryhausen. Ray Harryhausen was a lad when King Kong came out in 1933, and he was so blown away by King Kong that he kept going back to the theater to see King Kong again and again and again and again. And he not only tried to figure out how the special effects were done, how King Kong and the dinosaurs were brought to life, he actually began making his own animation models, creating his own stop motion animated films. He met and visited Willis O'Brien, became an assistant to Willis O'Brien. Ray became one of the animators on the 1949 Mighty Joe Young, and made the leap from being Willis O'Brien's assistant to pioneering his own way of working essentially solo. He did have help from his father, who would construct the armatures, the inside of the stop motion models that were created to animate for films like Beasts from the 20,000 Fathoms. And Harryhausen revolutionized making it possible for low budget films to feature stop motion animation. Warner Brothers bought this little low budget $200,000 film, lock, stock, and barrel. They bought all the rights from the producers for $450,000. And then they pumped another $400,000 into promoting the film in 1954. They were one of the first studios to use television advertising to promote a new film. And they opened Beasts from 20,000 Fathoms wide. And the film became a major hit. It made over $4 million that first year that it was in release. That's a huge return on investment. The producers of the film kicked themselves in the ass for the rest of their lives that they had sold the film lock, stock, and barrel, because they didn't see any of that profit. However, it did jumpstart not only Ray Harryhausen's career, and Ray Harryhausen went on to do tremendous work, which I'll talk about next week. It's also the film that was such a worldwide success that in Japan, Toho Studios decided that they would make their own version of the Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. And while the Rhedosaurus is forgotten for the most part today, except by fans of Ray Harryhausen, the Japanese incarnation named Gojira in Japan, released here in America in 1956 as Godzilla, King of the Monsters, became an incredibly popular film. And Godzilla became one of the first dinosaur pop cultural icons. Okay, I've now gone past the 2-hour mark. And I hope you've enjoyed this. We'll wrap this up next week. If there's any questions, I'll take them now. If I put anybody to sleep, I apologize. And we'll pick up next week from this point in time. Any questions? Bring them on.
Yeah, go ahead, Abu. Sorry,
Yeah.
I was spaced
yeah.
out. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry.
I was just thinking about all the
My
beautiful art I saw. I was just like so spaced out by that Dory-like stuff. I was like, how come I've never seen the Rue stuff and the other? I mean, yeah, I was just thinking
it's
about
amazing
it.
stuff.
Yeah,
I will. I'm looking over the comments a little bit here. I will mention somebody mentioned Bradbury. Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. The title was lifted from a Ray Bradbury story that was published in the Saturday Evening Post in 1951. It was such a popular story in the Saturday Evening Post that I recently found it reprinted in a Saturday Evening Post Best Short Stories of 1951. It originally was called Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, the short story. If you're a Bradbury fan, it's the story you've read again and again and again in his collections under the title The Foghorn. The film was not based on the short story. At some point in the production, Ray Harryhausen, who had been a friend since childhood of Ray Bradbury's, pointed out to the producers, we might want to talk to Ray Bradbury and clear the rights to his short story. And the producers thought it was a great idea, such a great idea that they paid Bradbury not just for the use of the story, but also for use of the title. And that's how the title of that Saturday Evening Post story became the title of Ray Harryhausen's film. And Ray Harryhausen, the producers, were smart enough to add a sequence to the film in which the Rhedosaurus attacks a lighthouse, which is essentially the premise of the Bradbury story, The Foghorn. Somebody else mentioned Lee Van Cleef kicks butt. The reason Stephen Tucky mentioned Lee Van Cleef is at the end of The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. If you were a fan of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly and the Sergio Leone and Italian spaghetti westerns, Lee Van Cleef plays the military sharpshooter brought in to fire the radioactive shell that they have to place into the existing wound of the Rhedosaurus in order to kill it without spreading its radioactive blood and contaminating all of New York. And Lee Van Cleef indeed kicks butt in that role.
Hey, Stephen, let's, Abu has his hand up real quick.
Yeah.
So we'll let Abu go. There you go, Abu.
Yeah, my question was about Japanese tokusatsu. Like, which tokusatsu dinosaur or creature film do you love the most? Like, what
Which one
made
do I
you
love
go
the
boom?
most? That's a great question,
Yeah,
Abu. And you're referring to the kaiju, as they're now known.
kaiju films.
Right.
Yeah. Kaiju.
My favorite, I've got a couple of favorites, but I have to say that my favorite would probably be Gappa the Triphibian monster. Gappa the Triphibian monster. It wasn't even from Toho, right? It was one of the competing studios. Dai made Gappa the Triphibian monster. And no, it wasn't even Dai. It was Nakatsu Studio. I think it's their only kaiju film. And it's essentially sort of a remake of Gorgo, the British film from 1961, Gorgo. The whole premise of Gappa is they find and capture this completely fantastic sort of winged dragon, living dinosaur they find on an island, and they bring it back to civilization. And unlike Gorgo, where Gorgo's mother rises from the ocean to come and rescue Gorgo, both parents appear, trash Tokyo, and rescue their little baby. It has such a happy ending. But my first favorite kaiju was Rodan, and that's because the first Toho monster I saw as a kid on TV was Rodan the Flying Monster. And I still love that movie to this day. And the pisser is the only time Rodan's design works is in that first film. When they refabricated Rodan for the later films in the 1960s, Rodan reappears in Ghidra the Three-Headed Monster, right? It's a different suit, and he looks goofy all through the 60s. But I love that first Rodan, and it's unapologetically there's a nostalgia aspect. It's because it's the first one I saw, and it's just sort of like I saw it before I ever saw a Godzilla movie.
So have you seen the crossovers like King Kong versus Godzilla?
All of them. I grew up with all of them, and I've got a number of friends like Tim Paxton is a very good friend of mine who's made sure I've even seen the King Kong film from India that was made in the early 1960s, where King Kong actually. Oh, King Kong's not even the giant ape. King Kong is the name of the hero, the human hero. But a giant monster does appear in this film from India. I think it was made in 1962, Abu. And I will find the title and post it on Facebook for you. I'll get Tim Paxton to share.
Please do. I want to see.
Yeah, you have to see it. It's pretty amazing. So, yeah, and it was so popular in India that they did make a sequel. So see, there's even crossovers there. I think my favorite of the crossovers would be Godzilla versus Mothra, which played in America as Godzilla versus the Thing. And that's my favorite of all the original wave of crossover films.
Awesome. Hey, Stephen, in the comments we have Ian Richardson was asking that he noted that on several of the posters it was saying over a year in the making, and and he's like, why was that such a big deal?
That's a good question. First of all, Ian, it's all, pardon my French, ladies and gentlemen, it's bullshit. Okay. I will say though that it's possible if you count in you know, the development of the script and all that, you know, testing, Cinecolor tests. Maybe a year went into pre-production of Unknown Island, but man, it's one of those movies that they must have shot in 2 weeks, you know, if that. However, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms was almost a full year in production. Remember, Ray Harryhausen was essentially doing all that animation himself. He would sequester himself into his animation studio, which wasn't a posh space at all. It was a very confined area. And I got to meet and visit the home of Ray Harryhausen back in the 1990s when I was visiting friends in the UK. And I also got to interview Ray. He very generously gave me time during one of his visits to San Diego Comic-Con in San Diego, California. And I got to interview him for Animato magazine. And Ray repeatedly mentioned to me during those conversations that the reason he preferred working alone is the enormous amount of concentration it required to do stop motion animation. And Harryhausen is one of the few stop motion animators of his generation. There have been many, many since, but one of the few of his generation who I think really infused personality into his creatures, his characters. Like even when I was a little kid, I could tell after seconds of screen time that I was looking at something Harryhausen had done. It's almost like a form of alchemy that he could channel something very primal into those models when he brought them to life. This meant that, you know, the time that went into animating and doing the post-production special effects work on Beast from 20,000 Fathoms probably ended up totaling with, you know, pre-production, writing of the script, the live action shoot that Eugene Laurie, the director, completed, and so on. Yeah, I can believe that was a year in the making. Why would they put that on the advertising? Well, you know, at the time, especially in the 1950s, Hollywood was competing with television. Television was really beginning to penetrate American homes. You know, in the late 40s, after World War II, you had a few thousand TVs in American homes. By the beginning of the 50s, you had millions of TV sets in American homes. And one of the ways, not just Hollywood studios, but independent producers would try to compete with television was in their advertising. You know, this was the era of gimmicks, you know, different names for widescreen processes, CinemaScope, Panavision. That's why 3D took off in 1953 and 54. The 3D fad didn't last long, but anything that would convince an audience that rather than staying at home and watching something on TV, it would be worth your time going to the theater. And one of the ways they would do that is by touting how many thousands were in the cast or how long it had taken to make the movie. And that kind of ballyhoo, that kind of advertising was probably initiated by producers like Cecil B. DeMille. You know, he would produce a biblical epic like the Ten Commandments, and other producers would try to compete with those kind of biblical or historic epics, and they would emphasize in the advertising how long it took to make the movie. They live to regret it. You know, a movie like Cleopatra really did take over 2 years to make, and they lost a fortune on it. But that's one of the reasons, Ian, you'll see that kind of advertising, even with lowly science fiction films. And it probably started with George Powell's Destination Moon, which was released in 1950. And I seem to remember in the press book ads that said, you know, over a year in the making. And it was a way to try to convince the audiences, hey, a lot of work went into this, a lot of care went into this. It's not like just sitting at home and watching a variety show, Milton Berle or something like that. You're going to see something extraordinary if you pay to come see our movie. And that was a way to do it.
I was thinking too that it might just be it took them that long to get the cash together because they were like, really?
Well,
are we really going to make this?
Yeah, really. Yeah, that's well, you know, people should remember that making a film like Beast from 20,000 Fathoms back in 1953, that was a big risk. That was a big gamble. The only reason it got out there and the only reason Warner Brothers jumped on it, is in 1952, RKO re-released King Kong. They re-released King Kong 4 times after 1933. And every time they reissued King Kong, it made millions of dollars all over again. This is before television, right? And RKO reissued King Kong in 1952, and it was one of the top 10 box office earners that year. The same movie from 1933, because it was reaching a whole new generation.
Super. Yeah.
And because it made so much money, I mean, I still have in my collection the issue of Time magazine from 1952, where Time, you know, the cinema section has a photo of Kong on the Empire State Building, and it's their movie of the week. They tagged it as the movie to see that year, and that's why Warner Brothers went, okay, what can we make like King Kong? And there was no time to make anything like King Kong, but here's this little movie they're being offered, Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, and they jump on it, and they, you know, that was a money machine for Warner Brothers. They still make money off of it. It's out on Blu-ray now, so you know, it never stopped making money for them.
All right.
Any other questions, folks? I'm
What
sorry.
do you think of Phil Tippett's stop motion? Phil Tippett, the animator, stop motion animator.
Oh yeah,
of
I'll talk about Phil
Yeah.
Tippett next week. By the way, one of my favorite movies this year. One of my favorite movies this year. And I don't know how you can see it right now. It was playing at a film festival this summer. Phil Tippett finished his stop motion animated feature, Mad God, and it's one of my two favorite movies from this year is Mad God. And this is no exaggeration, Ian, I am not blowing sunshine up your ass. It took him 36 years to make Mad God. It was a side project that Phil Tippett was doing at the studio, and they finally finished it and put it out this year. It's amazing. It's an amazing film. Mad God.
Does that make it especially good? Super good.
Super
if
good.
it took 36 years, I mean,
well,
and these other things were lavish masterpieces.
Only one year.
This thing better pay off. This thing's got to pay off.
It is an amazing movie. I highly recommend it. It's not for everybody. It's a very strange film, but that's why I loved it so much, for sure. Any other questions before we sign off? I did go over 2 hours again. I would apologize, but hopefully this is interesting to everybody. Now, one thing I'll mention is I have a big thank you card, which I'll show at the end of part 2 next week. And I do want to mention that all of these presentations have been recorded. John, Stephen, and the sponsors are putting them up online. Usually it's a day or two before they go up online, but they're up there for revisitation or for, you know, steering friends, compadres, peers to them, anyone who might have missed it tonight. Or if I went on too long and somebody had to tune out tonight, you can catch it again.
It was awesome. And I just want to say at the end of this too, and you didn't go over that. You went about 1.5 hours, which was perfect.
Oh, good. Good.
You must have a wrong clock. Did you forget to
call back? It's still on daylight. You're right. Oh my God.
I figured, man.
I could have gone on longer. Oh well.
Yeah. But I think it was super. I just want to tell everybody.
I did 90 minutes then. That's good.
You did perfect. Right. It was perfect.
Right.
Everybody, I just want to let you know too, I forgot to mention this last week, but we are having a writing contest that does have a cash prize. It's about the theme of reanimation. You can check it out at our Facebook page. It's unfortunately you got to write something really fast and really good by Monday. But if you'd like to put in for it, there'll be a prize, and it will get published in a small chapbook by Concatenation Convention and Jackson District Library, which is our library system in Michigan. And then I just wanted to mention, I did. If you went to the website and you looked at the past events, I clarified some of the titles. And so we do have a couple of short films posted up there too, that Steve Albie-Scott had some stuff to do with those. And we had a small film director here. They're about 8 minutes long. They're about some of our past things. And the last thing I wanted to say is our first speaker that we ever had was Walter Mosley. And he has done some phenomenal things. But this week, Walter Mosley published today, came out an issue of The Thing written by Walter Mosley, which I think is so cool because he was super into Fantastic Four, so much so that he convinced them to publish a panel by panel a comic of that. So if you're just into cool stuff like that, where it's just this crazy mashup, there is a new
Wow.
issue of The Thing out written by Walter Mosley, and there is an alternate cover by painted by Lee Bermejo. So it's just really great. So if you're into nerd stuff, that I think is a big nerd thing that came out today. So check it out. So
If, to follow on that, John, I wasn't going to do this, but since you mentioned
Do it.
Walter's thing, my newest work in print, I just got in the mail today. I did the cover story for the new issue number 39 of Scream magazine, spelled
Oh yeah.
SCREEM. And there are 2 covers available if you order online. One of them is, they're both the covers for the article I wrote, which is an article on the 1950s monster movies of producer Sam Katzman. By the way, Sam Katzman's 1950s monster movies included 2 Ray Harryhausen films. It Came from Beneath the Sea and Earth versus the Flying Saucers. But that's the new issue of Scream, and it is Scream number 39. There's the title in the chat, and
Cool.
just came out this week. Mart Maddox was the cover artist, and they look great. He did one cover using the 1956 film The Werewolf, but my favorite of the 2 covers is the giant claw cover that Mark Maddox did, with the giant claw about to swallow a paratrooper in the foreground. So
Awesome. Hey, I wanted to say one more thing because I know that Stephen did mention Sam Glanzman, and I just wanted to make you guys aware of a great opportunity. There's a comic company called It's Alive, and they're selling original Sam Glanzman pages for $100 a piece from Atu. So if you want to be able to get a cool piece of Glanzman art, it's helping to fund the thing. But when I saw the Sam Glanzman for the dinosaur book, I thought, oh my God, that's so great. So
yeah,
if you guys want to check it out, they have some pages by Sam Glanzman, which I don't know how they're getting away with selling for $100. They're worth way more than that. So if you want to pick up something cool, that's awesome. So enough of the sales. I just thought I'd inform you of some of those things, but of course there's so much good stuff. Thank you everybody for spending your evening with us. Explore the page, invite other folks. Next week there'll be part 2, and like I said, in December we'll be doing another session, and there'll be a drawing for some signed stuff from Steven. So y'all have
We'll send out
go ahead.
an update email as well, and a reminder if you're signed up for the next one. We'll send out a little reminder about that, and I'll also send out a reminder about your registration email as well, just in case. So
yeah, and
Awesome.
this is, I believe, the 1 month where we're doing the lectures back to back. So there's not a week in between. I'll be back here next Wednesday at 7 p.m. Next week's lecture will go a little bit longer, so make sure you got a cup of coffee there with you. So that's all I'll say.
You got it.
All right, thanks everybody. It's been a real honor, and I look forward to seeing you all again.
Thanks.
Yeah.
See ya.
See ya.